Good evening, everyone, and thank you to my colleagues for the words of introduction, and particularly Gordon Perry, also from ACC, who's been working furiously to make all of this possible. We live in strange times in many ways. Information is ubiquitous. We know about the most intimate details of what is going on in Syria, through to the latest disaster that may have befallen another part of the world. And of course, our daily lives revolve around whatever soap opera unfolds within our specific countries or cities and so forth. And what this reminds us, of course, is that we are fundamentally interconnected. And this has become profoundly apparent in the most recent times as we realize that there is nothing that happens within our lives or within our countries or in our cities that doesn't immediately become topical in the most furthest corners of the world. And in the case of South Africa, of course, particular trials around athletes and around visitors to our city is what constitutes the imaginary about South Africa at the moment and about Africa in many ways. And this is, of course, completely devoid of any realism or reality, but it speaks to the disjuncture between what interconnectedness via a mediatized world means and our different consciousness that is required. Now, what this also reminds us of course, is that we live in a vortex of extreme economic instability, dramatic environmental change, and constant and often violent social upheaval. And amidst, at the epicenter of this vortex, what we are confronted with is the incapacity of our governments and our states to understand what this requires in terms of new global governance and sub-regional governance arrangements. And whilst our governments are essentially struggling to come to terms with the radicality of transformation that is required, there are few people in the world that are able to read the signs of the times, that are able to then connect the signs of the times to what is required at the level of thought, at the level of institutional retooling, and at the level of building new cultural imaginaries. I can think of no other person on this planet, through my work, that stands out as a leader in this regard than Aromar Revi. So it is an incredibly profound privilege and honor to be able to introduce him tonight and to draw attention to some of his many, many accomplishments. Now, we've provided a synopsis of his bio for everyone in the audience and on the website, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that most recently, in the last 6-7 years, he's been spearheading an unprecedented initiative in the context of India, where he's building up a prospective independent national university for research and innovation that will address specifically the challenges of urbanization, and in the process invent a new field of study called urban practice. Alongside that, if that's not an ambitious enough job, he's also been very active on the global stage. He's a member of the Leadership Council of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, established by the Secretary General of the UN, and in that capacity as co-chair of the Urban Thematic Group. And through that work, they've been able to spearhead a global campaign over the last 18 months that have seen us bringing together multiple universities, social movements, and a range of cities and city leaders to all insist that as we configure, as we contemplate what the world is that we are making and what the world is that we will be inheriting by 2030 as defined by proxy through the next generation of sustainable development goals, that we really come to terms with what the urban transition means for that conversation. And this is an uphill battle. It is a complex challenge. And as you will hear tonight, I am sure that there is absolutely no one better to be leading this particular intellectual and political and policy challenge. And so I encourage you and I invite you to not just lap up what you will hear over the next 50 minutes, but to engage with the ongoing work of both the urban group of the SDNS, but also with the remarkable work that the Indian Institute for Human Settlements are creating at the moment. And in that process, not simply admire Aromar's work from afar, but also become part of this incredibly important and urgent movement that is required to see social justice in the world, and most importantly in our cities. So Aromar, with a warm Cape Town welcome, please share with us your thoughts tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Minister, representatives of UNDP and the European Commission. It's a great pleasure to be back in Cape Town, to be back at UCT, and to spend time with colleagues and friends at the African Center for Cities. I think this is really appropriate in some ways and sort of interesting that we have a South Asian speaking at the first lecture in Africa of this Kapuscinski series, especially because for so many years, for many of us who've read his work, he's one of the great travelers and humanists who's not only spanned Africa, but if you've read some of his books, has spent a lot of time getting lost and doing interesting stuff in Asia, especially in India. His renditions of what happened in India when he was there and afterwards are actually very interesting. A very special person, somebody who kept the histories under his, evidently under his pillow, and used that as a way of trying to understand and sort of redirect how the world is currently sort of constructed. And what I find personally very interesting is unbelievable that somebody of his ilk and time would arrive at extreme events in political and social history and record them and also comment on them as, both as a scholar and as somebody sort of engaged in contemporary events. So I'm really glad and honored to be here. And I'm going to be sort of provocative in this discussion, open up something that's quite interesting. I'm going to try and tell you a story, not in the vein and the capacities of Kapuscinski, but very much within the Indian sort of tradition of storytelling. It'll neither be science nor social science. It will sort of neither be structured nor unstructured, but it will have many layers to it. And I will sort of encourage you to look at the deeper questions that are hidden behind in this process. And in some senses, the key sort of protagonists of this tale, if I were to call it so, are the planet, the states, especially nation states, which are engaged with this engagement, and us as citizens and people in at least two different incarnations, which I'll try and show you. So we're going to be talking about urbanization, but I try and sort of lay it out in a much wider frame. If I go back to Gandhi was very simple in his way of looking at things. The real touchstone of all of this stuff that we do, the investments that we make, the policies that are set together, is really about changing the everyday lives of ordinary people. And if you're not able to do that, much of our research, much of our thinking, much of our doing actually doesn't make much sense. And I guess the core thing that we're talking about here is the role of cities and towns in making that possible. Cities and towns have been around for at least 5,000 years, if not longer. But we're coming to a period in the life of this planet, about 100 years between, let's say, the mid-1950s to 2050, where we will shift from being predominantly an agrarian, rural civilization across the world, even though some bits have been more urban than others, to one that's predominantly urban. And while this is happening centrally at the moment in Asia, it's not very long before it will happen in Africa. And I guess that's the preparation. The question is, how can you enable these processes to make changes in the lives of ordinary people in everyday working? But to do that, I guess one has to examine how these kind of changes may take place and what the big constraints are. So if I were to jump from an image of Africa to one of India, that's the Red Fort in New Delhi, the place where the Prime Minister of India gives a big speech at Independence Day. But inside this image are held some of the very interesting structural challenges that one deals with. It's not only a question of dealing with everyday life. Everyday life is important, and that's how things actually change. It changes with us and the structures that we're part of. But there are also constrained and great opportunities around the structures that we see here. So what you see here, right in the top here, is the fort which was built by Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan, the man who made the Taj Mahal. And that is, in a sense, India's pre-colonial past. And then inside there, we have heritage buildings more than 100 years old that the British built for us there. Those are the barracks of the British when they actually occupied this fort for 150 years and ruled this country. So we have this great tension in Indian urbanism between the pre-colonial, which is on this side of the city. If you go back, you'll see Shah Jahan's great world city of that point of time. The colonial, which infects our imagination and our imaginaries of what should actually happen. New Delhi, which is built and designed by more or less the same people who built and designed Pretoria, so you understand that process. The modern, okay? The modern construction, this is the metro, the big metro mall there. But the most important thing is something that you cannot see in this photograph. And the Prime Minister, when he stands in the ramparts of Red Fort to address the nation, sometimes doesn't know exists, but it's very central. We had at one point of time almost 150,000 people living in the riverbed that runs behind this great fort. And that, I think, is the most important challenge that we deal with in our cities, at least in the South Asian context, trying to maintain a continuity across what one may call 500 years between the pre-colonial, the colonial, the modern, and the informal. It's coming together and finding solutions that can actually bridge that. And this, in some senses, this is the power of Kapuscinski, because he talks about the informal, he talks about the everyday life, and through that, he's able to analyze and understand, the great predicament of humanity and people at this current point of time. So that's the context. If I step back and look at this with a more theoretical frame, the question then is, how does one make change in the systems? How can one make the kind of changes or enable the kind of changes that sort of, enable these kind of big transformations? This is from a piece of work that I was sort of tangentially involved with, a mentor and a very famous environmental scientist called Danelle Meadows. She put together a wonderful article, very short, recommend that to students here, which looked at the leverage points in a system. And I'll refer to this because there's a very interesting South African policy document that came out a month ago which talked about these levers of change. The question here is, as a system scientist, as somebody who looks at how change can be affected and catalyzed, what are the ways of doing it? And she lays down there 12 different ways of making significant change. I'm not going to be dealing with the stuff that's in the gray, because most of us in our everyday life focus on those questions, on the constant parameters and numbers, how much compensation do I get? What is the currency, dollar conversion rate? What are the growth rates it functions? Those are the things that we fight about. But effectively, if we want to deal with structural change, if we want to look at things that make the lives of people and countries and society different, the most important things are way down there at number 5, 4, and 3. How does one change the rules of the system? South Africa is a remarkable example to the world, because you had a set of rules which were unacceptable to a society and to the rest of the world, and through a long period of struggle, you changed the rules, and then, of course, you reorganized your institutional systems, number 4, the power to add, to change, to evolve, and self-organize. And that process, as we're seeing, is not complete. We talk about that in the context of apartheid planning, and apartheid planning, in some senses, in the way that your spatial structure of your cities is currently organized. And Vanessa Watson is here. She's shown that to me with my own eyes. It's something that is still alive today, because it's deeply ingrained in the process. To change that is one of the most significant urban and political problems we're dealing with. But finally, if you want to change all these processes, the thing that makes the most significant difference is to change the goals of that system, to change where the system thinks it's going. And of course, the system is us. It's not something outside us. It is to change the goals that we're looking forward to. So, for example, something like maybe 200 years ago, we decided, or some parts of the world decided, that slavery was an unacceptable form of engagement, something that's dramatically changed and impacted the history of Africa, for 500 years. The system goals were changed. It took a tremendous amount of conflict, potentially ending in the American Civil War, to actually upend that process. And of course, slavery still persists in many parts of the world today in different forms, but that was an idea that ended. We changed the goal, which said that it was unacceptable for us to use other human beings to be able to maintain our economic and social systems. Similarly, the idea of human rights and a whole range of other processes, the European Union is very much part of that whole engagement here, are fundamental changes in the way that the goals of the system was set. So in 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights essentially set out a set of goals for all countries at that point of time, it was a reorientation of how the world might actually work itself through. It also came, of course, with the process of decolonization. So what I'm saying is we're actually at a very interesting juncture at the moment around sustainability, something that's emerged over the last 40 or 50 years as a critical question in which we may require a reset, a reorganization of the core goals that the world, our countries, and our institutions need to be dealt with. And of course, the most difficult things. Changing mindsets and paradigms. That's a lot of what science is all about. In sort of engaging and actually throwing up processes by which mindsets and paradigms are changed. These are the most dramatic changes that are there. And of course, something that happens very rarely, millennium events, when we're able to transcend paradigms. We go back, of course, to the axial age, 500 years before the start of our 2 millennia here. And you had, in many parts of the world, a whole range of people, many of them from our continent, who are asking fundamental questions. And that, of course, enables us, at least in that point of time, through the faith traditions, to understand what those paradigms are and actually work beyond that. One of the questions which I'll come to later is it possible and is it necessary for us to engage with that? Does the urban transformation actually bring up questions that require us to look at the transcending of these paradigms? So that's the frame that I'm looking at. In the context we're dealing with, the 21st century is, of course, an extension of the 20th. We lived through that. Many of us were born in the 20th, and we're going up to the 21st. But the 21st century is going to be fundamentally different. This is a fantastic image from Northern Europe, and I hope we will see something similar here around Cape Town. You have the wind. If this might be the big renewables transition that we see here in the next 15 or 20 years, as you move out of let's say, your coal dependence. So the basic contention that I'm making here is the 21st century may be very different from the long 20th century. One of the things that's very obvious is that the larger economic powers of the 21st century are not going to be rich, are not going to be OECD-like. And that makes a fundamental difference for the nature of power and engagement across the world. Now that's sort of the obvious thing. But more than that, I think the most important thing that happened to us in '69, when we got our first images that came up from Apollo 11, was the realization, because we could now look at ourselves, that there is actually only one Earth, and it's a very, very fragile planet, and we are messing with it in very significant ways. And unfortunately, we've messed with it so seriously that it's coming back to bite us in some senses. So the planet will survive. The question is, will our cities, will our civilizations, will our way of working with our economies survive in that context? Now, there's no question about the planet surviving. The planet has been doing that for a very, very long time. And of course, the other thing is, there is no place to escape to, because we just do not have the resources to set up something that can get off this planet. So we have to manage with what we have. We have to considerably reconstruct the ideas that we have of how to deal with that. And then the other big thing, which is, if you look at the long sweep of history, this is based on some of the work that I'd done earlier, based on Madison's work there. If you look at economic development and how it's actually structured, you see a fundamental change. So this is the 17th and the 18th century, India and China basically producing about 55% of world output. You have this decolonization, this whole colonial engagement that's there, the build-up of the European colonies, and of course, unfortunately, I couldn't put South Africa there because you're somewhere very close to the y-axis. You see the whole the whole Russian engagement and sort of the post-Soviet collapse. You see Japan working out. The big and most interesting thing, of course, is this massive bounce back by China, which is actually going to be one of the most important defining events. And India, of course, we're not very competent at this kind of stuff. We're about 20 years behind them. But basically, Asia is returning to the center of the global economic system. And that's a significant change. This has, I guess, significant sort of opportunities and challenges for South Africa specifically, because now the center of the world system is no longer around the Atlantic. It's shifted to the Pacific, and it's about to shift even more significantly to the Pacific Indian Ocean. So there is a change, and let's be a little provocative here. This is not the normal way that Northern European maps are set up. Maybe the lights are... Can you recognize South Africa? It's up there towards the north. So why did I set this up this way? Because from the 16th century onwards, the red dots here, in some senses, were the center of the world system. That started collapsing, of course, about 100 years ago with the end of the First World War. And then you have a build-up of these regions, the Asia-Pacific, South Asia, Southern Africa, Brazil, and that part of Latin America, Central America. And of course, the big questions that are in yellow, the emergence of West Africa, past East Africa, and Indonesia, and parts of West Africa. And the reason I picked this up is this is evidence that you can see from space. This is the footprint of cities. So if you look at the change, and I'll show you a set of slides around that, this is really the driving force that we will see. So what I'm saying is the geography of development, the geography of the world economy, etc., is shifting, and we need to understand and deal with it. So these sort of new urban geographies are actually going to create new histories. There's an interaction between the two, which we have to understand and appreciate very carefully. And then, of course, because we are now, 7.5 billion going to 9 billion, and we like to believe that there is no frontier that we cannot conquer, including the atmosphere, the oceans, and everything else. This is just one aspect of global environmental change. I work a little bit on this. This is from the latest IPCC assessment report, which just came out last week, things that we were part of. The big issue here, of course, is that here we're pretty much on track to a 4-degree world. 2 degrees is dangerous climate change. A 4-degree world is actually almost unthinkable. We have the evidence here, it's very clear. We can see steps, system by system, that we are in deep trouble. What's the evidence of that? Those of you who climb mountains here, you might recognize this mountain. This is Everest. This is a photograph taken by Mallory in 1921. Royal Geographic Society team went back, and after a lot of difficulty, relocated the exact spot. And they took this photograph in 2009. That's what happened to that glacier. It's happening. I mean, I can tell you from the science side, but this is real. It's going to happen, and it is happening. Extreme weather is happening in our lifetimes. But the thing that really bothers me in this, and we've talked about that, is the ecological implications. So this is a very simple graph. I won't take time to talk about it very much. This looks at the maximum speed at which species can move, through natural processes of sort of ecological succession. Fine. Different species going all the way from trees to freshwater mollusks. This is from the latest IPCC report. And when we saw this, some of us were both stunned and wanted to cry at the same time, because these are the lines that show you what happens as the isotherms move towards the north and the southern pole. So essentially what we're saying is we're pretty much here at the moment. This is where we'll probably be if nothing happens in Paris next year. Rodents, primates may make it. Of course, agricultural systems may make it because people may make it happen. But the basic ecosystems that we're functioning with, the stuff that we see in the high biodiversity regions of Cape Town around this, one of the world's great biodiversity spots, that won't make it. It is just not ecologically possible for that movement to take place. So we're in really deep trouble. It's there, the evidence is very clear, and we need to probably do something about it. So if I were to put it into a very, very simple framing, the fundamental challenge of the 21st century as far as human systems are concerned is our present consumption requires 2 worlds. We've been in ecological deficit since the mid-1980s. Population growth, because we're going to go from 7.5 to 9.5 billion, we're not sure exactly what it is, but it's going to go past 9, will require 1.5 worlds. Ending poverty, which is absolutely the most important priority for countries like us, and also much of the low and middle income countries, will require about 2 worlds because of the acute deprivation that large people live in. If you add these 3 up, you have 5.5 worlds. We only have 1. And we have to sort this in less than a century. Because that climate process, just one of many large global environmental changes, whether it's desertification or biodiversity loss, is there, and we have created it. It's not something that's come to us from the outside. So it's incumbent on us to actually take a position and do something significant about that. So given this broad sweep of history, where we are and where it might be, the question that comes up is, why are cities important in this whole process? Have cities got a role? Cities are interesting. Some people do some stuff inside it. But governments typically have not been very interested in this, excepting, when they tend to rebel or create particular kinds of problems. So a quick rendition here of why cities are important. This is just a a slice of the urban sphere, just cities that are bigger than 750,000 100 years ago, before the First World War, and what you find. The population of the world at that time was 1.5 billion. Seems like an odd number. India's population is coming close to that. China is pretty much there already. The urban share of the world population was just 13%. And you can see that for where the big cities are. There's London, there's Paris, the big European cities. You find the northeast in the US, Chicago, Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, etc. That's Nairobi here. And of course, we have the two big colonial cities in India. But the interesting thing that you should watch in this set of slides, of course, is the gross world product. The estimates of the gross world product at that point of time, just before the First World War, was $2 trillion. The urban share was significant, 30%. Let's fast forward to 1950. Post-war, after a tremendous amount of destruction across the world, including in Poland and etc. And what do you see here? First thing that you see is a growth of a lot of cities across the world in pretty much every geography. But again, primarily, like I showed you earlier, around the North Atlantic, fine? Population goes up from 1.5 to 2.5 billion. The urban share goes from 13 to 29%. World product grows from 2 to 7%. And the urban share jumps very dramatically because there's a sudden movement that's starting to take place. And then, let me jump to the present. World population jumping from 2.5 billion 50 years later to 7. Urban share, of course, this is why many of us are here. We suddenly realize that the world has become urban and there are more people in cities than otherwise. But actually, the transition had taken place much, much earlier. The gross world product in urban areas had actually turned over in the 1980s. And this is the number to watch. We've gone from 7 trillion to 70 trillion in 60 years. A tremendous expanse of economic output. Of course, differential across the world. And most important in that is that cities are the key driver of this process. So when I talk to mayors across the world, I'm saying, look, it's not the question of the people who live there. Of course it's about that. But the real thing that's driving this process, the thing that we have to look out from the consumption side, from the output side, from the employment side, is the urban economy. And the urban economy, for better or for worse, and most incremental jobs are driven by cities. And that is why, especially in today, post-2008, cities are absolutely critical. So if I look at the UN Pop Division projections, just look at these maps. Look at the growth of cities across the face of the world. In some senses, it could look like a blight. But on the other hand, those are the places that are creating the jobs. They're creating the economic opportunities. That's what enabling the transformation of societies. Of course, with the risks and the externalities that this kind of process goes. So, it gives with one, but it takes with the other. So let's look at what's happening here. As you move, just the incremental world product from the cities is over, it's close to $1 trillion a year. So this is the big story that we're just getting to understand now in the world economic system, within the United Nations, and of course within critical countries. Of course, the country that is probably understood it the best, that has enabled this big transformation over the last 20 years, China, is the country that has been able to take so many people out of poverty, and in a sense has enabled us to achieve at global scale the MDGs. I mean, if it wasn't for this Chinese urbanization, the largest urbanization in history, 10 million people transforming, their lives from one side to the other side, this would not have happened. But the same thing is about to happen in South Asia, and frankly, we're not prepared for it, and that's why we're building this, hopefully this great university to address that question. And because I haven't shown you stuff after 2025, the big move after that is actually going to come from sub-Saharan Africa. The interesting thing about the urban process, of course, is because cities enable concentration. They enable concentration and hence economies of scale and scope. And of course, as I said, the negative externalities, the concentration of risk. Cities concentrate not only economic activity, but a whole range of other processes. All of these 8 transitions happen in cities, are very strongly driven by cities. The demographic one, which is very important to the global turnover, the health transition, which is now going in 2 directions, non-communicable and communicable at the same time. The education transition, of course, how many universities have you heard of that live and function in rural areas in the world? Very few, because it's a function of cities for the last 5,000 years to be able to contain that. The energy transition is going to be played out in the cities. Similarly, the environmental transition, especially in the cities of the global south, is happening at the same time. We're doing brown and green and gray all at the same time. And that is a big challenge for us. We're doing this in 20 or 40 years. Things that took Europe 200 years are happening in 1/10 of that period of time. So it's obvious that we will make mistakes. We really don't know how to do it. Nobody's ever done this in all of history at that scale. Similarly, something that's enabling tremendous transformation, the information transition, especially in our country, it's connecting people. It's enabling people to talk to each other, to connect across the world, as we can see in this sort of internet webcast. So all of these things are only possible because of the role that cities play. But, of course, there's a false side to that. And the false side is that cities also concentrate risk. So, the contention that we've had for some time is that urbanization is just not a mega trend. It's not something that we also have to cope with. It's not only like, whatever, an energy transition, etc. It is a giga trend. It's something that happens every 4,000 or 5,000 years. The only challenge for us is, for many of us in the global south, it's happening in less than a century. In some countries, it's happening in 40 or 50 years. And the question is, can we build the institutional capacity? Can we build the understanding? Can we build the culture? Can we build the technologies that can enable us to use this opportunity for change and use it for good? And of course, the big question is, the contra question is this kind of urbanization inevitable? Is it something that's going to happen? Should we just sit back and let it go? And of course, the hidden question within the brackets is this kind of urbanization that you see there? And of course, this is a great symbol of liberty and freedom, which created Manhattan. But is this, and you have the new tower there, so it's a contemporary photograph, very recent. I took it when I was at the General Assembly recently. But whether this kind of urbanization is inevitable across the world. And I think this question of imaginaries and how they translate is a very important one. We have scholars in this room who have written about this, and I think this is a critical question for Africa, for Asia, and for a lot of us. This is a great thing for its time. But is it something that we want to have for all time? Is this where we want to consign the future of our people and our cities to? Is something we need to look at quite carefully. And let me take you back in history. I'll take you back to a place that you never heard of. This was a world city in its time, but its time was a long, long time back, 4,500 years ago. This city actually, the reason I put this up here is, we talk about sustainability as far as cities are concerned, and we think about 100 years or 200 years, and that really challenges our planners. Because planners typically think in 10, 20, 30, etc. They think in decades. This city persisted as a key trading city for 1,000 years. It was inhabited for 1,000 years. So the question is, can we learn something from these examples? Even though they were in different contexts, the world was much smaller, etc., etc. It's a city called Dholavirov as part of the sort of Indus system that's there. This is a reconstruction from archaeologists. And the interesting thing about it, because that's from photographs that I've taken there, is that there was a shift in the climate system at that time, which actually, at least there's a lot of academic debate on this, actually crashed the system. But you can see that in how the city actually adapted over the 1,000 years, how they built these massive reservoirs. And this is a copper culture. This is a chalcolithic culture. They've cut into the living rock here. You can see the scale of the person here, 85 by 10 or by 80. The size and scale of these reservoirs are unbelievable when you stand in that as a person and imagine that they've been chiseled out, brick by hand. To be able to enable this settlement to survive is something that we have to actually understand. So it's not that the challenges that we're meeting today are unique. Many of them have been met before in different circumstances, of course. So this city or this town, we didn't have, by our standards, of course, it's a town. Today in India, anything under 10,000 is, a village. This city and town actually had remarkable systems, which there is a village just next to this. This had underground sewers and water supply, and it had a water harvesting system about 4,000 years ago. The village that's next to it doesn't have toilets. That is the contradiction of development as we have it today. So what I'm saying is there's tremendous lessons for us to learn from the past and transcreate into the future. Another great history, and it has a connection with Cape Town, is the world city of Goa, the city of the black ships, which went from Portugal to China and Japan. Look at the population of Goa. 1550, one of the great world cities at the time, 200,000 people, remarkable. The arsenal in Goa is bigger than the arsenal in Venice at that point of time because of the amount of wealth that went through. But what happened? In less than 200 years, the city died. And the city died because it did not understand the environment in which it was functioning. Very simple thing. We talk about it in environmental health. They had dug wells and they had cesspools. And it's no wonder that they had sequence after sequence of cholera, malaria, typhoid, and plague. Eventually, the Inquisition decided that this was a cursed city, And what we have today, and this is a World Heritage Site, is nothing left of the fabric and just the cathedrals, because the people took away the buildings and rebuilt a new capital 15 kilometers away. So what I'm saying is, there's a lot for us to learn from history. Unfortunately, in our country, maybe we spend too much time thinking about the past. But there are lessons that, we should have learned as people. So in the current context, that's Mumbai. And the interesting thing, and this is not the text, it is the Browns. The Browns is a piece of work that my colleagues worked on maybe 8 years ago. That's the mapping of the informal settlements in the city. So the question, of course, and you can see that. Look at the scale of informality in the city. Those are the slum areas. 60% of the city actually lives in these informal settlements. And that's not because they want to live that way. It is because our economic systems have failed. There's a very severe land market failure here, which is designed and orchestrated. So what I'm saying is, we are perpetrators and creators of the processes that we've forgotten about in the past. And this is what's happening in a great world city. And you'll see that in a second just now. And if I go back again to global scale, this is what we're doing. This is the observed changes in climate change. All the major cities of the world mapped out from here. This is the historical record. Let's look at what might happen in the future. This is what the IPCC has put together. This is from a chapter that some of us wrote. Here we are in Cape Town. This is the great scenario where we actually, if Kyoto had happened, if the COP in Paris actually works itself out, this is where we might go. But actually, this is where we may actually land up. Okay? 6 degrees at the poles, about 1.5, 2 degrees at the mean. One of the more interesting sort of, better organized. So the thing to see here, of course, is the spread of cities and the range of temperatures that we'll expect to see. So it's not only the question of heat. Heat, of course, is the proximate thing in the tropics. It's also the water systems, which I haven't shown yet. This is just temperature. This is stuff that we can pretty well understand. So look at the distribution of the temperature, and look at the distribution of the city. So what I'm saying is, there's a continuity of that experience. Whether you go back to Dholavira and people trying to deal with climate issues there, the environmental health questions of Goa, and of course, every culture and every city will be able to talk to us about this. Because the history of civilization and its collapses, and that's why I asked the question, is it inevitable that we will have this urbanization? It isn't. If you look at the history of civilization, in more cases than one, in fact, pretty much all of them, the collapse of cities has led to the collapse of cultures. So where we're going to is not inevitable. It's based on the choices that we make and the way that we take it forward. So, we can stand back and say, oh, well, at the end of the day, we're all dead, nothing can happen about it, etc. The inverse question is urban transformation possible? And many people across the world, especially from governments, are not necessarily sure that this can be done. It's, people like us or practitioners who work in cities and municipal officials who feel that this might be possible. I think this is a question that we have to ask us again and again. Is this really possible? Can we convert, this could be an Asian city, this is actually an African one. Can we convert this chaos into something different? It's actually not chaos. It's actually very well ordered. It's extremely productive. It does remarkable things that you can't see unless you have the eyes to see it. And I guess one of the answers is in these two images from a city that this is Shanghai, just about the time of the turn of Deng Xiaoping. Okay, so we're standing and at Puxi looking at Pudong. This is the Bund here. This is the old French settlement, all the wonderful stuff, those of us who have been there. That is the farmlands that have just been turned into some kind of economic development. Fine. This is 1987. So if you do not believe, of course, there's a dystopia that's hidden behind this. But the fact is that these changes are real, they're happening, you can touch them, you can feel them. And this is the ascendance of China, and of course the big political move that took place at that point of time to turn towards the West, to turn to economic trade, to join the WTO, etc. This is the physical manifestation of the process. So this is certainly possible. The question is whether this kind of transformation is what will do the best for us within the constraints that we're functioning with. The environmental constraints, more important, especially if we've seen the sweeping changes in North Africa, the social constraints. Because before the environmental limits are reached, I'm fairly certain from my own experience, it is the social and political constraints that will really create the biggest challenges that we have. So I guess the critical question for us then is, we know that transformation can happen locally, and South Africa is an interesting example of how that can happen. We know that the big transformation that's necessary at the global scale. How can we link that? And is it possible to do that? And I think that is the heart of the question of the urban SDG? Can we actually link the two together? Is there a connection between them? How can it be sorted out? Of course, Rio is a fantastic example of this. On this side, you have Copacabana, and on this side, you have an entire city of favelas. So it really is, and you know, people were on the street. 200,000 of them were on the street last year, you know, asking for a whole range of things, saying, look, you know, we need some things, but please, for God's sake, give us our toilets, etc., etc., etc. So the linkage between the local and the global, I think, is a very interesting question. It is an important political question of the 21st century, and I do not think that we've engaged with it adequately. In some senses, at least from those of us who look at it from, let's say, a little bit more theoretical side, there are 5 dichotomies that we have to resolve. And I'll just deal with them very, very quickly because the story is sort of longer and I don't want to hold you up. The first one is the imagination of the rural versus the urban. There is this imagination across many parts of the world, certainly in my country, which is, you know, whatever it is, 31% urban, even as I believe in South Africa, that it's important, as far as the urban elites are concerned, to keep rural people in the places where they are, so that they can be better off and more people don't come to cities. This is not how urbanization takes place. All the urban scholars will tell you that it doesn't work this way. It's much more complex. There are a whole range of other processes that are there. But we persist because of our public structures, the way the state is organized in many places, to partition this out. And I understand the reason for it. It's much easier to have a department or a ministry of urban development and rural development and break them down, and you can manage things differently. But the core question here, of course, is the understanding of speciality, of how space plays itself out in development. And that's something that in the creation of the nation states as they came to some parts of the world from Europe was an important part in terms of territory, but not in terms of the internal dynamics of how settlements and structures were organized. So that's the first question. That ties itself up with the second question, which is, I guess, a deep political thing that we're dealing with just now, is the relationship between national government, the nation state, and regional and local governments. The questions of subsidiarity, the questions of agency, and the real question of, if we are going to have 9 billion people on the planet, how 200 entities, even though they may be extremely powerful, have all the resources and the taxes and the capacity, can actually manage the future of so many billion people. That's a governance challenge that even the Chinese have not been up to trying to do. I mean, they have a fairly decentralized system when they want to do it. So this is something that's actually burnt in to our constitutional structures in many parts of the world. It's burnt into our imaginations. And this is something that we do need to look at, to my point, to my mind. And of course, the big question which came to us from Brundtland in the WCD, part of Rio, etc., is intergenerational versus intragenerational questions. And of course, which comes before the other? And there's been a big debate on this. And I think, you know, for those of us who work with poverty and vulnerability, there's no chance that you can deal with intergenerational questions unless you deal with intergenerational questions, especially questions of poverty and inequality. And, you know, that's a debate that's very important. It's central to the question of cities. And then finally, something which I'll just touch upon. I mean, this is a subject maybe of a longer lecture. And that is how we actually give precedence to particular forms of capital. Now, you know, in academic circles, Piketty's become very interesting and, you know, become flavor of the year, etc. But he makes an important point, and that is that in that sequence of capitals, and I'll just lay them out, 4 of them: financial capital, physical capital, human capital, and natural capital. Right? So natural capital is the capital that, you know, attracts least interest and the lowest return on investment, because most of that is sort of externalized and we don't actually count it. That's the reason why a lot of this stuff is there. Right? Human capital in many parts of the world, especially those parts of the world that are flush with capital, is something that you don't necessarily count, but that's probably the most important thing that we require for development in the global south. So even there, returns on investment may be slightly higher than in the natural capital domain, in agriculture, in mining, and whatever it is. But in the imagination, the kind of space that will be given to, let's say, the human capital domain is somewhat less in terms of returns. And then, of course, you have physical capital, the basis of industrialization. The reason why we've had this great debate in the SDGs about whether we should have a separate industrial goal or not, because the standard form of development means that you've got to move from agrarian to industrial to post-industrial. Right? So that's the next step. And then finally, of course, the thing that's driving the world as we see it, and certainly our cities, financial capital. And what Piketty talks about is the fact that as long as financial capital is privileged over the real economy, you're going to see a movement of capital between generation to generation to the people who actually control the financial capital. And that is what, if you look at that cascade between financial, physical, human, and natural capital, creates the structural instability, the inequality, which we're coping with. So whether it's farmers whose children do not want to come and practice agriculture across the world because they need to come to cities, they want to be educated, they want to move from that into a profession which can actually produce stuff, and we have national development plans that are trying to industrialize to make that happen and create jobs. Or of course, everybody wants to go off and become a merchant banker and be in one of the great, centers of world capital. That is a set of rules that we have set for ourselves, and we know from environmental economics, from the work that many of us do, that those rules do not work in the real world. Nature doesn't respect them, the second law doesn't respect them, and yet we persist with that because that's a wonderful mythology that's worked for certain parts of the world, but it's worked for a certain period of time and for a frontier economy, and that's the interesting thing that Piketty shows. He shows that it works for the United States for a particular period in its history, but if you take a longer view of it, there's some deep contradictions that we shouldn't necessarily base ourselves in. So I'm saying that these processes actually underpin the debate, and if we don't go back to them, I don't think we'll be able to unbundle the process very clearly. So the question then is how we try to respond to this at global scale. We tried to respond in the late 1990s by setting up the Millennium Development Goals. So what's the big difference? And I'm going to characterize it. Obviously, it's much more complex, and I wouldn't make this kind of a statement in a purely academic context. So there's a common genealogy between them, and you can actually trace it back to WCD, from that to 48, and the human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There is this whole idea that you can set goals and actually redirect how development and processes will work itself out. But the interesting difference, at least in my characterization of it, is the MDGs were relatively easy to do because they were agreed. The big compact post-war, et cetera, starting with Europe and going everywhere else as decolonization worked itself out. The MDGs were fundamentally about development goals for poor people in poor countries. So a large part of the world, not a very large part of the world economy, and hence, in some senses, the sort of political economy of aid and transfer of technology, et cetera, could work. We're in a slightly different situation because of two things, at least in my contention. One is 2008, which actually has shaken the basis of the world economy in many places, and I guess both the US and Europe are really hurting on this. And we know that the emerging markets are actually driving 2/3 of the growth at the current point in time. That's one thing. The second thing is the realization that the environmental externalities are very serious and we can't run away from them. Those two things, in a sense, have allowed us politically to create a framework now that embraces all people in all places. And this is a huge shift. I mean, just analytically, it's a huge shift. Because you're dealing now with countries at $500 per capita and others at $100,000 a capita. Almost 2 orders of magnitude together. They're both in the same frame. They sit in the UN and we're debating a common framework because there are many things that connect us. As humans, of course, the question is, does the connection work for nation states? Does it work for firms? Does it work for other entities that sort of deliver and manage the system? And I guess, as I said, the closing window of opportunity, new actors at the table. And one thing, having seen this again since the MDGs, the thing that does strike me a lot is post-2008, the private sector is very strongly in the room for real and obvious reasons. Because if you want to do trillion-dollar infrastructure or even billion-dollar infrastructure, if you don't bring in private capital and if you don't bring in private executors, it's almost impossible for you to do it. So that's a big shift. And of course, the discussion which is hidden behind, in some ways closed doors, is the question of a new global governance architecture. Not only at the level of security, et cetera, but the fact is that development now, or sustainable development, is essential to the project of bringing the world together and making sure that we don't tank the system, whether socially or politically, as far as that's concerned. So, about a year ago, the STSN, which I am part of, actually framed this in a fairly simple way, and this came from the experience of Agenda 21, et cetera, and said, look, if we are spanning all of the things that are of critical concern to us in development, we need to have not too many goals. They have to be relatively simple. They have to, of course, encompass the challenges that are determined by each sector. But more than that, they have to be simple enough that young people can actually understand them. Because in some senses, these are not things that you set up models around. They are aspirational. They're direction pointers. They point you in a direction which you can then test, like I started with. Is it making a difference to my everyday life? Is it making the difference to my commute, to the job security I have, to the kind of quality of food I have, to the healthcare that I have? So this is a set of 10. And I won't sort of deal with it in detail, but what I will highlight is 6 and 7. So when we had an intense debate on this, what you'll see here that 6 and 7 are actually complementary. What we're saying is, and I said this on the floor of the UN, you cannot have sustainable cities without having sustainable agriculture and rural prosperity. That's the history, if you go back to Iraq as it was Mesopotamia at that point of time. Because cities on their own are not able to actually create all these processes. They critically depend on ecosystem services, on peasant populations, etc., to manage the processes. So there's a symbiosis which is very critical, and we have to accept that. It's not keeping people in this place or the other place. They have to have the right in the current world of self-determination of where they would like to go, where they would like to stay, where their children would like to be educated, etc., etc. But these two have to come together, which means that this is actually a definition which is largely in our head. It's come, of course, from historical experience, but it may be necessary for us to re-examine it because we're now living in a world of nearly 9 billion people. These rules were made when the world was 1 or 2 billion people strong. We're now in a world that's full, that has lots of feedbacks. We may have to re-examine the rules that have been made in the past because they don't work for us. And I think great countries, great nations, great institutions are able to re-examine these questions and come back and look at them. So the MDGs, in a sense, didn't do justice to urban areas. And we saw the SDGs as an opportunity to establish a new governance architecture, addressing some of the questions that I talked about, the equity question, the question of global commons. And that was a big debate in the UN about whether we should have a climate goal or not. Is it going out into the COP or X, Y, and Z? And of course, hidden behind that, in the discussions about the global financial architecture and the financing of development, is the real hidden question, and that is how are we going to collect first and then distribute our surpluses to enable all this stuff to happen, because it will require investment, whether it's human development, schools or healthcare or infrastructure or a decarbonization of the entire system. So in some senses, there is a new debate there is a new engagement. It's not formalized, it's not there in the structures of power, but it's happening because it's real. And I think we need to recognize that and open ourselves to that discussion. So in some senses, what we said was, yes, urban transformation is possible. We've demonstrated this at local level. We know that it's necessary to enable at the global scale because that's what the global economy is going, that's where the bulk of our people are going to be. But it has a lot of attendant risks in it. So if you want to bring this together, it will be a very useful thing to have a globally directed goal which will enable us to bring these ideas together and at least tell us whether we're going in the right direction or whether we have to make a change. So in some senses, when we articulated this, basically what we said as the movements and the agencies working on urban questions is that this is a 21st century idea. There are some of those goals that are actually 19th century ideas, things that are actually established that we have not delivered on. The end of extreme poverty is one of those. This is an old debate that goes back to the 1850s. We might be able to deliver it just now if we actually establish a new system that's more equitable within country and between countries. And I think there is a global compact on that. That's something that's agreed. There's no question about that. Whether multidimensional poverty will be addressed is another question. My own sense is if we do the right things at the right time, make the right investments, even that could be addressed. And then, of course, tied to that, education, healthcare, etc. So these are traditional, what I would call early 20th century goals. The two new ones that have come up and are most contested because we can't get a head around them very much. One, of course, is climate and global environmental change, where climate is a euphemism for that. And the second one is cities, because we've never really understood how this scale of change can be managed. We don't have the governance systems to take that into account. We certainly don't have a multi-level framework that works from the global system downwards. So essentially what we did was, because nobody believed us, when we started this, they said, cities? What are cities? Why should cities have a goal? It's just a silly idea that a few people have. So we basically, over a period of almost a year, brought together all the major urban institutions across the world. That was a very, very interesting task, to build a common platform, and you can see them. And then what we said was, fair enough, bring the big institutions together, whether it's Habitat or C40 or ICLEI or UCLG is not enough. The real players are the regional governments and the cities, because that's where the action happens. That's where the rubber hits the road. That's where the biggest challenges actually take place. So we mobilized across the world around this to tell the nation states, to tell the United Nations system that, look, there's something real happening there. There's a very important set of innovations here that you cannot neglect. And then we brought together some of the better research agencies. You can see them across the world who are helped support this, including institutions like ourselves. And I think the most interesting turning point took place last year, where in January we had the mayor of Rio, among many other mayors, and he wrote to the SG on this. And he basically said, we started this process in Rio. We affirmed it in Rio plus 20. But what you're forgetting is that cities and towns are the places where we can actually address these challenges and problems and turn the challenges into opportunities. And I've quoted from his letter there. He basically said that you cannot do this. You cannot effect the SDGs without having an urban goal, not because we want to bring everything into the urban. Obviously, you want to have education and healthcare and water and energy separately. But this is the locus in which action and transformation actually happen. It's very simple. Without place, without your home, without a place to work, without a real place to engage things, people really can't do anything. We don't only live in our heads in some senses. So we brought together about 200 cities and regional governments and pulled this off. And there was tremendous debate, as part of that process. And there was pushback. There was serious pushback on these 5 counts. The first count was a lot of countries, and this is on YouTube, you can see it, this debate that went on for 2.5 hours in the UN. Countries were asking me, saying, this is great, formulation is nice, but what's going to happen to us? If you create an urban goal, what's going to happen to rural development? What's going to happen to the funding that happens to agriculture? What's going to happen to drought? What's going to happen to famine? This is a bad way to deal with the world. And then we came back and said, look, at least the way that we look at it, these systems are not separated. They're complementary systems. We cannot divide the two together. We have to look at the continuum. And that debate, which is a very, very reasoned and, personally, that was a tremendous opportunity for me to learn, actually turned around. Literally in those few weeks in the open working group, people realized that this was an artificial division. It was a bureaucratic division. It comes from an earlier history. And we do not need to be captured by that. Obviously, in the long run, in the short run, you're not going to change how governments work. But the second thing, of course, people were saying, look, too many goals. One more urban goal means you have to have a rural goal. Just get out of our hair. It's very complicated. Of course, there was a simple thing there. This is the fulcrum of a lot of where the world system actually plays out. If you don't have it there, then you might have real trouble in making the whole framework work. And then there were some countries who were saying, look, the most important thing for us is industrialization. For industrialization, you require infrastructure. Infrastructure is much more important to us than our cities. And we said, well, that's true. Infrastructure is very important. You cannot build cities without infrastructure. But there are other kinds of infrastructure too. Infrastructure is not only used for industrialization, it's used for agriculture. If you don't have good irrigation systems, in many parts of the world, you can't have food production. And of course, infrastructure is critical for services. We wouldn't be able to talk if we didn't have the internet infrastructure for us to do it. So that's also a narrow way of looking at things. You require infrastructure for everything. There's no use of trying to tie it down into a particular sector. It cuts across rural and urban areas. Transportation is a wonderful example. You can't really have adequate rural development and agricultural development unless you have transportation. But rural transportation and urban transportation are slightly different from each other, and we need to unbundle that. And then, of course, there was a whole set of people saying, okay, urban is very good, it's fantastic, we should mainstream it. It cuts across everything. And of course, those of us who had some political sense said, well, that's a good idea and it'll be nice. But we know that if we don't get the salience, we'll lose 15 years. And the world cannot wait for those 15 years. Because if we do, and a lot of Asian and cities go down the tubes and get into trouble, then we're all in trouble. Whether it's on the climate side or on the economic development side or even in terms of social security, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, the big challenge, which is the key question that I'm trying to, I'll open up for discussion here, is the idea of localization. The idea that nation states will determine what will happen in the world, and there will be a common framework that applies to every nation state is what underpins this. But as soon as you get to the local, it often means that the challenges in Sao Paulo are very different from the ones in Cape Town, are very different from the ones in Singapore, are very different from the ones in Shenzhen, are very different from the ones in Delhi or Lucknow. So the question then is, in a system that's used to having, simplified solutions, how do you have the same indicators for everything? So that was a very interesting debate, saying that maybe you have to have two sets of things, some things that are universal and some things that are local. And we have to understand and accept that this form of plurality is very critical for us to deal with stuff. So the question that we said was, why do you use 19th century ideas to deal with this? And our response was very interesting. We basically took two cities, and this, I laid out. And we said, okay, let's take this goal, and we will show you how in actual practice the only way to do this stuff is to go down to city level. So we took the one on extreme poverty, and this is interesting. We plotted New York and we plotted Bangalore next to each other. And that was a bit of a shock, because in some senses, there's some things that New York, for example, I'll just skip a few slides here. This one is most obvious, air quality. Look at New York's situation as far as green cover is concerned. The only green that you have in Manhattan, unfortunately, is Central Park. Bangalore is a city of gardens, etc., etc., etc. So you can find in different cities different kind of challenges across this sort of multidimensional engagement. If you're able to drill down to city level, you can actually find solutions. So, of course, you can have something that's globally comparative, et cetera, and we've looked here at 3 or 4 different things. I'll just quickly take you through. Let's say something around about infrastructure. So this is an infrastructure thing. This looks at internet access. This line here is basically 1990. This is 2000, and you can see the massive build-out of internet infrastructure in Bangalore. Because now, most people have cell phones, we have high-speed internet, and in some senses, you're catching up with New York, and that's, So when you start looking at this thing, you start unbundling it by different factors, it becomes much more concrete. You can actually look at it, you can actually operationalize something which can work quite clearly. So that was our response, and of course, we had more debate. There were 4 more sessions, and at the end of it, we had a set of 10 goals. This is what came out. So the good news, of course, was starting from nothing in the middle of 2013, we now suddenly had goal 11, which looked very much like what we wanted, excepting for one small thing. The word productive actually dropped out of this. And for those of us who work with employment and stuff like that, that's probably the most important word. That got actually wrapped into something else. But we're there. And hopefully, as the process plays itself out over the next year, there'll be something that will actually happening. So essentially, as sort of a wrap-up of that, the Urban Sustainable Development Goal is inspirational, aspirational, and operationalizable, especially around cities. It can bring together multiple sectors. It's not easy. We're not pretending that it's easy. But it will require reimagination of the institutional and financial architecture for this process. And that, I think, is a real challenge to be able to bring things together. And of course, you need the commitment of all these actors to enable the reframing of governance to make this possible. So there are a few things that we may be missing. There are probably too many goals at the current point of time. At least that's my personal opinion. There are too many targets and indicators that confuses ordinary people tremendously. And if you want to help ordinary people, and many of us in government and in other things are fairly ordinary, it's probably best to have a smaller set. The second thing is that we've dropped out rural prosperity, and for me that's a huge problem. I've worked for 30 years on cities and rural areas. This is a problem. It needs to come back. The linkage between cities, productivity, employment, and poverty reduction has been broken. This needs to be reconnected. It does not work for us in the cities of the south to deal with this. Infrastructure as tied to industrialization is useful, but like I said earlier, what about village infrastructure? What about agricultural infrastructure? What about services? Cities are not only industrial. That's only a phase in development. The implementation architecture is overlapping and horribly confused. And how much resources and means of financing will be required to play is not in this discussion. And typically, especially those of us who work in public policy, if you have a separate discussion about financing and a separate discussion about implementation, you have some problems later. You need to bring that discussion together, and at least you'll be able to pull back some of the bright ideas that you have that will not actually work. And finally, there's a very weak emphasis on legal, regulatory, and institutional capacity. And for cities, that's a huge challenge because we really don't know how to deal with it, and we need to deal with it in tremendous scale in under 20 years' time. And that's why so many of our colleagues from ACC and other places are sort of working on that. And of course, the fundamental question is, there was a limited dialogue with the primary agents of change. The people who are really at the forefront are not in the room to have that discussion. And that's what we've been dealing with. I'm going to skip a lot of slides. I guess the key question for us is, how do we implement this if the goal actually comes together? That's the core question that's there. And of course, I'm going to skip this very quickly. We do know how to implement this. This is a very quick case, something that we've just done, a $100 billion investment plan for one of India's new states. And we know how to play this through. You look at the employment structure, you look at how the economic output works itself out across the state, you look at the relationship between economic output and workforce, because the critical thing, of course, is jobs at the end of the day. You look at how it works out differentially across the state by sector. You go on then and look at the environment and how that constrains itself. You look at infrastructure, thermal and hydro, the big issue, I think, at the moment in South Africa. In some cases, you look at oil and gas infrastructure. You look at the road and rail and other things. Basically, you can unpick it. When you work at a concrete scale where real things are happening, you can unpick this and you can deal with these questions in space, because that's exactly where things actually happen. And then you go on to look at risk. And at the end of it, and I won't show it to you just now, you come up with an investment plan, a plan for intervention. And of course, we know that a plan is never what you put down on paper. It's a process that has to be established. So the institutionalization of that process is really the critical thing that's there. The plan is just a piece of paper. How you implement it is fairly critical. And then something which I will just flash you through very quickly. Anyway, there's lots of stuff that's there. And this has been the last 2 days' discussion in Pretoria. We had a conversation on video on this. And in some senses, when I look at this, at the IUDF, something that's just been cleared about a month ago, is that correct, by South African cabinet. If you look at the questions that I was raising earlier, it's a slightly different way of organizing it, but you've touched on all the critical points. You've touched on questions of planning, you've touched on questions of mobility, you've touched on questions of housing, you've touched on questions of land management, you've touched on questions of infrastructure, and you've touched centrally on questions, obviously, of economic development and employment. So in some senses, as one sort of travels and works across the world, you're seeing this kind of process emerging not from one or two, and we did this for the IPCC in a very systematic manner, from hundreds of places. And those places, unfortunately or fortunately, are not in national government. Because national government is important, but not necessarily engaged with the reality of what's happening. Plus, the space to be able to innovate is actually local, where you can fall on your face, you can make mistakes, you can step up and do something else. So this is a very interesting frame, because it touches on all these questions. It is within, I imagine, the South African schema of things. It addresses your development challenges. It is aligned to a national development challenge. So the question then is, how do you match this with a universal expectation that works at international level and the way the global system works? And I think that is a dialectical question that we're asking just now. We need the UN system, we need the global financial system to try and understand that there really has to be a conversation about this, and we have to look at a new architecture. So again, all the elements are there: transportation, human settlements, planning, land use governance, etc. I'll sort of flash through it very quickly. So what I'm saying is, city scale, we know it works. We know it works in hundreds of places, not perfectly, and not along all dimensions, because cities are very complex. They're the most complex environments that we've created in all of history. It's not some space station or some great new technology. It's cities that we've created. And frankly, we've crashed them more often than we've actually run them properly. We also know how to do that, or at least we're engaging with this question at national scale and at regional scale. So at regional scale, we not deal with it. We're engaging with those questions at national scale. We're also accepting that we need to have a multi-scalar engagement. This is a new architecture that was not conceived when the Western European nation state was conceived. This is a new set of problems. A new set of challenges will give us a new set of challenges. So this is a difficult conversation, because when we have it, we've opened this up with representative of member states of the UN. They say, look, we guys will handle it. This is an intergovernmental discussion. This is some stuff that you guys should keep out of, because you're sub-sovereign. But it's like the old idea of the divine right of kings. Yes, you may be sub-sovereign, but you're the only guys who are actually sorting out the stuff and organizing things and whatever it is. So we've initiated a very interesting process, and you can see it here. And that is a political discussion which actually happened in New York in September, just before the General Assembly, where we said, okay, we brought in the key permanent representatives, the representatives of key countries, the ambassadors in the room. Remarkable. That's Eduardo Paes, who spoke about Rio and make the commitments to actually set up the first sustainable development plan for a large megacity in the world, saying, look, we set up Rio, we're going to run with this, and he's actually running with that. Anne Hidalgo, who's the mayor of Paris, who made a commitment to actually look at climate change in cities and lead a process that runs up to the Paris COP. And your famous, Tao's there, and Bill de Blasio, who made the commitment in this meeting, which was then reiterated in the climate summit the next day, that New York would make an 80% reduction in its climate footprint. So what they were demonstrating there is that cities and local governments can stay ahead of the curve because they're smaller, they understand what's happening. But of course, and these are the big megacities, this is, I guess, a political statement. So these are rich, well-organized, and extremely well sort of resourced in terms of human resources and capacity. The challenge is what happens to the secondary cities, the places where the most significant opportunities for employment, for change, for development will take place. So this is the opening of the conversation that we started, saying there has to be a conversation between sovereign, sub-sovereign entities, between cities and regions and nation states. We cannot, at least in my appreciation, implement the Sustainable Development Goals with just a group of 200 or 193. The 200 plus 5,000 more, maybe starting with 500 large cities, is what you need to make this happen. This is too complex a problem. We have lots of things that we don't understand. And it's only by bringing in a much larger set of people that we can actually move forward in this process. So, very interesting, the Lord Mayor of Copenhagen, the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, and the Mayor of Shenzhen, meeting for the first time, exchanging notes for the first time. So the interesting thing that we're seeing actually is a learning that's taking place very, very rapidly between cities across the world. And in some senses, and of course climate is one example, and we're finding that in other areas, this is something that can help us get ahead of the current governance challenges that we're dealing with. So, where are we going? An eight-stage process to mobilize, to convene, like we're seeing it, to negotiate, because eventually this is it's an interstate process. It has to be set up by the member states, communicating and inspiring people that cities are the future. They have the risks and they have the opportunities simultaneously. And of course, the critical thing is, we don't know how to do this. We have to be honest about that. We have to experiment, and we have to have the space for experimenting. And what better way than doing that than letting it out to an urban system where you have, tens or dozens or hundreds of cities who can try and do things and do stuff. And the Chinese have done this very well. And of course, we have to educate ourselves. And finally, this will not work unless we're able to implement this process. Theory is great. It's very important when we're making quick changes. It helps us underpin and understand processes. But the critical thing here is the implementation. If we're able to implement, we can make a dramatic difference because cities provide us the opportunity to make that big difference. And we're hoping that, by this redirection of process, by bringing together all these constituents and trying to reframe the way that we've actually engaged in the debate, that some significant changes can take place over the next few years and then accelerate from now till 2030, because that window of opportunity is honestly 20 or 30 years long, whether it is from the social or the political side, and certainly from the environmental side. Why give up that opportunity? The world is full of people. It's a great opportunity to actually change the world. We have more people alive today than pretty much of all of history. A great cultural opportunity. And cities are the place that hopefully that's going to happen. But not in opposition to places that are villages, because that's the culture that we're coming from, and that's a culture that we need to respect. And that's what's going to give us the resilience to build a different and a differently organized world. So thank you so much. Thank you for the patience.